nuestra actividad. En la clase de hoy tenemos la visita muy apreciada por nosotros del profesor doctor Fran Viljoen. Él es abogado sudafricano y dirige el Centro de Derechos Humanos de la Universidad de Pretoria, en Sudáfrica. Allí dirige una maestría en Derechos Humanos y Democratización, una maestría similar a la nuestra que forma parte del mismo programa de maestrías en Democratización y Derechos Humanos. Esta es la primera actividad del doctor Viljoen aquí en la Argentina, en Buenos Aires. Hoy dará una conferencia magistral sobre los derechos humanos en África. Mañana tendremos en nuestra sede de la calle Santa Fe una clase sobre el sistema africano de derechos humanos, y luego los estudiantes de la maestría van a tener otra oportunidad de encuentro con él. Quiero decirles que los que han visto los antecedentes del profesor Viljoen lo saben bien, pero es una persona muy destacada en el área de los derechos humanos y de la enseñanza de derechos humanos, y debemos destacar que su maestría, su programa de derechos humanos, ha recibido el reconocimiento, el premio UNESCO a los derechos humanos. Nosotros estamos muy agradecidos de que él haya tenido la disposición de venir hasta la Argentina, en su primera visita acá, así que estamos muy contentos, y estamos seguros que vamos a poder aprovecharlo. Como parte del programa nuestro, es una gran satisfacción tener la posibilidad de escuchar al doctor Viljoen y recibir parte de su experiencia. Así que los dejo con él, no quiero interrumpirlo más. Muchas gracias, doctor Viljoen.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Let me just say how happy I am to be here. My apologies that I don't speak any Spanish, or you would not want to hear the few words I speak. I think for me personally, it's my first visit here to Argentina, and it's also gratifying that the global campus, the Global Human Rights Campus, of which we are part with the university here, could be manifestly showing its collaboration through my presence here. And also to say that just like you are here on a program for human rights and democratization, we have a similar program in Pretoria, I think, as you know. We have 30 students who come from all around the African continent, and they spend 6-7 months with us in Pretoria, after which they then depart to one of our partner institutions in the continent, where they complete dissertation and an internship, and then they return to Pretoria. So I think it is gratifying to see what you do here, what we do there, as part really of a global attempt to ensure greater respect for human rights and to explore the possibilities of democratization in parts of the world where it is not obvious that your efforts may necessarily succeed. I think it's also gratifying that this could be seen as part of a South exchange or exploration of knowledge. It's very much also, I'd say, a feeling of being at home that I experience as I'm here. I recently went up north. I was in the United Kingdom, and obviously there, just on a very basic notion of seasons, it's a very different place. But coming from South Africa to Argentina now, it's winter. We share in the south. We share winters, and we hope that our sharing will go much further beyond our geographical share, what we share geographically, to the intellectual sharing that we will be experiencing in the years to come. The topic of my paper, or my address, is, as was indicated, human rights in Africa. But because of the focus that we have as a center and the focus of the lecture tomorrow, I thought I would talk about human rights in Africa, but I would link that to the relevance of regional human rights protection. So what I will set out to do is to talk about aspects of human rights as it manifests itself in Africa, but then also link that to the need for regional protection on the continent, and briefly also compare and contrast that development with developments here in Latin America in the inter-American system. If one talks about Africa, I think one is invited to generalize. I want us perhaps first to think about this concept, human rights in Africa, and ponder, maybe meditate, if you like, on the idea of Africa as a geographic entity. Now, I'm sure you are not every day working on or busy with the idea of Africa. So I invite you to think about the 55 states of the African continent that includes the island states. It is complicated in a way. If one looks at the African Union, the intergovernmental organization in Africa that brings together the African regional human rights system, for example, that organization has 54 member states. Because Morocco, one of the African states in the Sahel region, as you all know, had withdrawn from the African Union, or as it was called, the OAU, in 1984. We have the addition of one new African state recently last year through South Sudan, and we have a contested state, the Western Sahara, or the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, which is in fact recognized by the African Union, and that was the cause of Morocco's withdrawal from the organization. On the other hand, the United Nations does not recognize the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic as a state. It is not a UN member state. But be that as it may, I invite you further to think about the states you know in Africa, maybe the powerhouses of Africa. Nigeria, I don't know, South Africa, the country from which I come, perhaps. Imagine the contours of the continent and think if you can roughly locate those states in the continent in your mind's eye. But then think also of the states that have now undergone the winds of change, the Arab Spring, or maybe just the Arab Awakening. Think of countries like Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, that I'm sure we all know. But for the purpose of our lecture, think of the countries that you associate with human rights violations. Which would those be? Perhaps, first of all, Rwanda, the genocide in 1994. You'll think of Sudan, Darfur, that has become a metaphor for government repression and lack of inclusion of minorities within a country. You may think of Sierra Leone, Liberia, countries that have been undergoing conflict for a long period of their recent histories. But the point I want to make is that if we talk about Africa, obviously, just like in Latin America or in America, we cannot easily generalize. There are huge differences, significant differences in terms of colonial histories, in terms of personalities involved in the politics of those countries that require us to think of these countries as individual entities rather than as part of one generic unit. So as much as we will try to decipher some common trends and make some general observations, I put this caveat about the geographic diversity of the continent. The second caveat I put is also on the handout that was given to you, and that is a temporal caveat. Africa, human rights in Africa, when are we locating our question? When are we looking to analyze the situation at? It has become customary to divide the history of Africa into three broad phases: the pre-colonial, the colonial, and the post-colonial phases of African history. However, it is also not uncontentious to use those markers, as I think you would agree, as if colonialism is the marker by which all the other phases fall in place. Instead, perhaps we can call the first phase of African history the phase of traditional African history or societies. The next phase, the phase of the slave trade and colonialism. And the last, the independence phase. So again, the caveat is to say, but if we talk about human rights in Africa, when are we looking at? I would, in answer to that, in a sense, then briefly say something about human rights in Africa in respect of each of these three phases of African history. For fear, obviously, of generalization, but with the caveats already put. In terms of traditional Africa, the question is sometimes asked whether in traditional Africa, or pre-colonial Africa for that matter, there were human rights. Examples are given of cultural practices that perhaps did not uphold the sanctity of life. However, I think if one draws the distinction between the idea of human rights as the ontological focus on being, human rights perhaps as dignity on the one hand, and human rights as something utilitarian, human rights as a means of accountability, as a means of redress. This distinction should inform our asking and answering the question whether there were human rights in Africa in the traditional society context. Surely we must agree that human dignity as the cornerstone of all societies, also African societies, was respected in traditional Africa. In fact, if one looks, for example, at the way in which older persons were treated, Africa in its traditional guise has much to advertise or to guide societies all over the world by. If there were aberrations perhaps of conduct pertaining to conquest,